Welcome to our new video where you can learn math
And you can love math.
This is Mathaya!
So why are we here again?
We are here to test if they can solve simple and challenging math problems.
Chuping, ano na mo ka diri?
Ay, oh, bitaw no. Trash talk, mali ko. Sorry.
Bye.
Bye-bye! Gaya tayo ko sa trash talk.
Meanwhile. A few moments later.
Maing hapon kaninyong tanan, kini si Renzel.
O kini si Janelyn.
O ngano na mo ta diri Jinglin?
Apot lang ano na matari.
Of course, mangutan na tag mga tao diri sa kilit-kilit ug mga math problems. Since mangutan na matag math problems, sa atong kinahanglan.
Math wizard pa yet.
Naata na our very own Wednesday brother, Ricardo.
A few inches later.
Hoy, Ricardo! Asa magiging ng math, Cardo? Asa masigit gamit ana sa itong kinabuhi? So math, ang atong ibuan sa math, puro na mga numero, mga letters sa ABCD, mga anggol-anggol. Kaya dili na. Math is also about understanding the concepts. Also nasa tayo makatunan sa math sa itong kinabuhi. Kung saan itong maging patient sa itong galingon, maging critical thinker sa itong galingon. Kung sa itong society, kani sila, sa ating tanan, kalibutan, everything around you involves math.
Hindi ka mo kalimutan.
Oh, tanan butang sa kalibutan. Yes, math is life.
Since we already have a math wizard and we already have math questions, all we need is to find participants. So here we go!
2 hours later.
So, hi ate kuya, kanan natin may pangutan na about ay related ni siya sa kanang math. So, first na mong pangutan na kay kinang mental ni siya, mental.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be
1 plus 1, bring down 1, carry 1. Huh? 1 plus 1, bring down 1, carry 1. Bring down 1, carry 1. Kami natin dapat na! Ambot! Kabo mo unsa? Kasi, hero na nangihi. Ah! Nadanay na dyan din. Nadanay na. For real na dyan din. What is the derivative of x?
Why?
Yeah.
Ato ba? Why ko na why? Derivative of x? Kasi x na kayo buyab na po na.
Ay, dili. Lahi man ang x sa math.
Ay, wala mami uyab. Ay, wala mami uyab.
Pabor yung pabor.
What is the derivative of x? Muna'y per minute mo ingon basta manguyab ka.
Ikaw, Brad.
Ikaw ka mo.
I love you.
Pwede mo uyab.
Dili
Kuya, dili.
Number man.
143.
Dili. Kabo ka unsa?
Derivative of x.
Number siya. Number.
Dili man.
2. Saan sabi?
What is the
1, 2. You're the only one.
One! Sige, makarat ako yan.
Thank you very much.
Day, kinana ko ipangtan na ni mo, Day. Kinakuan ba? Serious na bibig ni Day. What if? Samong go, Gani. Serious na gani. What is the integral of x squared? Wala mo ko rin akong math.
Uy, di ba lakpan ka na sa una ka grade 6?
Takpan sa yung math. Di, tandaan, joke na bita to. Maano ni serious to as in. What is the value of x in 2x plus 3 equals 16?
2x plus 3 equals
7.5?
Lose! 2 seconds lang! My God! Unsa to? Ay! Tapuan lagi day. Tapuan.
Wow!
15 minutes later.
Natin may kuhan, pangutana ni mo sa, pangutana ninyo sa partner. So, kaning pangutana kay, kaning kalabutan na sa math.
Ay no, kana nakabalita maguguma. Tagayusi ko no kay. Right ko no sa math.
Wow!
10 seconds later.
What is the integral of 4 sin x? 4 sin x? Integral? Wrong.
4 sin x dx. Sige, amo sa na ako. Balitaan sa namo kay mga babaw sa na mga yun.
346 minutes later. Much later.
Okay guys, so ang answer kay happy na dito. So may answer ko yun. Right, so ako yung answer yun. Ow! Dili. Ang answer kay Kuan, close na to siya. Ang answer kay 4 negative cos 4 negative 4 cos 5. Yay!
Early the next morning.
We've interviewed 3 group of people with 3 different math questions. So let's now solve those 3 questions with step-by-step solution. The first one, what is the derivative of x? In solving this derivative, we will use the power rule. Power rule states that f of x is equal to x raised to the power of n, then the derivative would be n times x raised to the power of n minus 1. This rule is one of the basic rules in derivatives and be applied in polynomials with exponents. It is understood that there is an unwritten exponent 1 on the x. By the power rule, our n here is 1. Then let's follow the procedure of power rule. We get 1 times x raised to the power of 1 minus 1. Then simplify. We now have 1 times x raised to the power of 0. And any number raised by 0 except 0 is 1. So further simplification, we have now 1 times 1 which is equal to 1. Therefore, the derivative of x is equal to 1. Next is a linear equation with one variable. 2x plus 3 is equal to 16. What is the value of x? First step is to isolate the terms with x to the left side and the constants to the right side. We add negative 3 to the both side or just simply transpose 3 to the right. We now get 2x equals 13. Since our goal is to find x, we divide both sides by 12. 2x over 2 is equal to 13 over 2. 2 and 2 here will be cancelled. We now get x is equal to 13 over 2. In decimals, x is equal to 6.5. Last math question is about integrals. In solving the integral of 4 sine x, we will use theorems on anti-differentiation. One of the theorems states that if c is any constant and f is a function, then the integral of c times f of x is equal to c times the integral of f of x. Going back to the integral of 4 sine x, by using the theorem we mentioned earlier, we now get 4 times the integral of sine x. Next is find the integral of sine x. Basically, the antiderivative of sine x is negative cosine x plus c, the constant. Now, we have 4 times negative cosine x plus c, which is equal to negative 4 cosine x plus c. Our sample integral is an indefinite integral. Note that a constant is added to the indefinite integral to get the general solution or the general antiderivative. Because the theorem states that if g is an antiderivative of f on an interval, then every antiderivative of f on an interval is given by g of x plus c, where c is an arbitrary constant. We have now answered all the questions asked by our Mathaya interviewers to the public. If you haven't really yet the process of derivatives, integrals, or finding x in polynomials, don't worry. Visit our Facebook page, Mathaya, for math notes and tutorials. Don't forget to like, follow, and share our FB page.
Several song-filled hours later.
So nakita jud nato guys nga kasagaran sa mga tao karon nga dili kay sila into mathematics kay mao lagi na nag-isa do kanang wala sila knowledge about ana sa kanang equation or problem. So our group Mathaya, we create it to enhance the abilities sa mga estudyante. So our goal is to envision people's math anxiety, that it will be gone and be confident enough in discussing math topics. So guys, please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification below so that you will be notified to our next videos. And don't forget also to like and follow our Facebook page Mathaya for more information. So, bye guys! See you to our next vlog. Bye bye!
Day 3. Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later, later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later, epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, a few minutes later, days later, longer, opening night later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of days later, 16 paranoia 48 hours later, 2 hours later, much the following yesterday, many hours later, 24 hours later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day. Meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. 2 weeks we hope you enjoy 11 this minutes later, construction montage. A lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 later, 5 hours later, 2 days later,
20 years earlier.
72 approximately 10 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning later.
Subscribe to my channel, like and click the bell.